Thank you, Diane. And it's my privilege to introduce Matthew Rothschild, who is currently the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. He's got a history I want to run over just a bit. Before joining the Democracy Campaign, he worked with the Progressive magazine for quite a few years. For most of those years, he was editor and publisher of the Progressive. And while there, he wrote a book entitled "You Have No Rights, Stories of American in an Age of Repression," and he edited another anthology. His opinion pieces have been run in the Chicago Tribune, in the LA Times, the Miami Herald, and a host of other newspapers. And he's appeared in Nightline, NPR, C-SPAN, and the O'Reilly Factor, which he says was an act of masochism. If you live in Wisconsin, you may have heard him on radio on the Mike 72.1 or on the Joy Cardine show on Wisconsin Public Radio, or you may have seen him on WISC TV with Neil Heinemann. You may admire him also for some other points that I discovered. He's a bird watcher, and his favorite bird is the Blackburnian warbler. A bird I have never seen and frankly had never heard about before. And the other thing that might interest you, for those of us who have academic inclinations, he has a degree from Harvard University, social studies and political philosophy, and he graduated magna cum laude. I give you Matthew Rothschild.
Thank you, Wayne. Thanks, Diane. Thanks, everyone, for coming. It's great to be back in Racine. It's great to see some old friends and to see new friends here. I've had a wonderful day here in southeastern Wisconsin. I spoke at UW Parkside earlier today to about 40 people, and we got a lively conversation afterwards, and I invite such a conversation when I'm done talking with my main thing that I have to say, or things that I have to say. We had a lovely dinner, by the way, at Old Madrid just now, and I was treated to dinner, which is a pleasure. And I asked the owner there to open another branch of that restaurant in Madison if she could. It's a wonderful place. I want to cut to the chase here pretty quick, and that is simply this. I am scared to death for the health of our democracy, for the future of our democracy. I believe our democracy is hanging by a thread. I don't take comfort in the platitudes about our great system of checks and balances that were taught in 7th grade civics class or high school social studies class, if it's still given in our high schools. I just wonder whether it's going to hold. And I'm not the only one who wonders whether it's going to hold. I've been reading a book that came out this year by two Harvard professors called How Democracies Die. And those two professors, their names are Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. They have serious concerns as to whether our system of checks and balances is going to hold. There are several threats to our democracy. Some of these threats predate Donald Trump, and I will get into those. And then, of course, there's the qualitatively different threat, which is Donald Trump, and I will get into that as well. The authors of that book, How Democracies Die, they make an important point. They make a lot of important points, but one is that democracies don't sometimes die overnight. They sometimes die slowly. They don't always die when a military general will seize power or bring a tank into the street or capture the president or kill the president and declare himself the new president and play martial music on the radio and TV all day long. Sometimes it happens in a different way. They write a lot of times the assault on democracy begins slowly. For many citizens, it may at first be actually imperceptible. After all, elections continue to be held, opposition politicians still sit in Congress, independent newspapers still circulate. The erosion of democracy, they say, takes place piecemeal, often in baby steps. And part of that piecemeal erosion, they argue, is the violation of the unwritten norms of acceptable behavior in a democracy. And we have seen this violation of the accepted norms of behavior over the last 30 years here. They cite two such norms. One is what they call mutual toleration. That is the toleration of competing candidates for each other, elected officials for elected officials of the other party, party officials for party officials of the other party. That mutual toleration has gone the wayside. And the other guardrail that they talk about, the other norm, is what they call forbearance or restraint. Restraint by those who are in power, especially if one party holds all three branches of government, like we've seen in Wisconsin over the last 7 and 8 years. Or with Republicans when they're in charge in Washington, that there is no restraint for exercising total power, and that it's all about power and crushing your opponents. And so that's, again, what we've seen. They call these two things, forbearance and mutual toleration, the soft guardrails of American democracy. And those guardrails have been dispensed with. And it began, I think, and they think, with Newt Gingrich back in the 1990s. Newt Gingrich, who had this contract with America, and Newt Gingrich, who rallied his Republican nihilists to shut down the government for weeks and weeks at a time, regardless of the suffering that imposed upon people. And then Newt Gingrich, who went after Bill Clinton for ludicrous reasons and impeached him even at a time when Newt Gingrich himself was having an affair. And that was one of the most ludicrous moments in our history, but it demonstrates that it was all about winning at all costs. A glaring example was Mitch McConnell, who said the very day after President Obama became elected the first time that his goal was to make sure that President Obama was a failure. And a more recent example was Mitch McConnell telling Obama that he wasn't going to give Obama the right to have his Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland, even get a hearing, much less a vote in the U.S. Senate. This is different from how it used to be. George H.W. Bush, who I didn't love by any stretch of the imagination, left a note in the desk of the Oval Office to Bill Clinton saying, "You're my president now, and I'll help you whichever way I can." That's not how things go right now. It's winner take all. Look what Trump said after the Kavanaugh nomination controversy. He didn't care. He won. That's all he cared about, that he won. So there is this flouting of the rules which has undermined the norms of behavior and helped to polarize the country. And extreme polarization itself is a threat to democracy. So that's one of the things that those authors point to. I want to point to a few other underlying causes that are threatening our democracy before we get to Trump. And one of those is the thing that I look at every day at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, which is the problem of money in politics. This is a really severe, corrosive problem. Jimmy Carter told Tom Hartman of Progressive Radio a couple years ago that essentially we don't have a democracy in America anymore. In Jimmy Carter's words, we now have an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery. Unlimited political bribery, and we see it every day in Washington and every day in Madison. I think you and I recognize that everyone in this room individually does not have, or collectively for that matter, does not have as much power as Charles Koch. Or you do not have as much power as Diane Hendricks. You do not have as much power as Richard Eline. You don't have as much power as Tom Steyer or George Soros, for that matter. Most of the people of this country, the vast majority of American citizens, have been reduced essentially to the role of bystanders in the political arena. Spectators. Sometimes blindfolded spectators at that, because we don't know where the money's coming from. All the dark money that contaminates our political system. And you might say, well, you mentioned George Soros and you mentioned Tom Steyer, along with Charles Koch and Diane Hendricks, or I could mention Sheldon Adelson. And so it evens out. So they're spending on the left and they're spending on the right. That is not a comfort to me. Our democracy is not supposed to be a contest with us on the sidelines watching a few billionaires on the left and a few billionaires on the right play tug of war. In a democracy, we're all supposed to have an equal tug on that rope. And we just simply don't. And we all know we don't. We all know that the system is rigged, that we don't have equal power or an equal say. We're supposed to have equal power and an equal say in our democracy. That's what democracy is really supposed to be about. And so we got to do something about money in politics. That is one of the main problems. Trump himself recognized this problem. Trump, at the first debate, you remember the first debate with all those Republican candidates on stage with him, and Scott Walker was up there without casting a shadow, even under the glaring lights. But Trump said, look at these people up here. I've given a lot of them checks, and when I call them up and ask for something, they give it to me. The system's rigged, he said, and people watching understood that. I mean, we all understood that what Trump was saying there was actually true. Here's a billionaire, throws his money around and gets his way. The system is rigged. He used the expression, the system is rigged. He knew that expression resonated with the American public. One of the reasons he knew it, because he'd heard Bernie Sanders use it to great applause, or Elizabeth Warren use it to great applause. There's a YouTube video of Elizabeth Warren using the adjective rigged about 10 times in 5 minutes that she did, before the last presidential campaign. I mean, everyone knows that is true, that we don't have equal power. The second problem I wanted to talk about, second underlying problem, is the crisis of journalism and media in this country. There are fewer and fewer journalists practicing. I think second only to dairy farmers in Wisconsin, being a journalist is a vanishing profession right now. Newspapers are dying out. There are fewer and fewer reporters not only covering what's going on in Washington, but covering what's going on in the capitals, in the state capitals. And who does that serve? That serves the hidden powers, that serves the corporations that are bending the rules, that serves the super rich that are essentially bribing our politicians and getting the policies they want. They get an inordinate amount of influence as to who the candidates are, what laws are written, what policies are enacted. And the problem is there's just not enough journalists to cover them and to expose them. And there's this consolidation of media, fewer and fewer owners of the large newspapers and networks. That's dangerous for democracy. We've seen that with this Sinclair enterprise, this outfit that owns a lot of the TV stations, that has forced its local anchors to regurgitate right-wing propaganda as editorials on their local news, verbatim all across the country. And so there's another problem related to this problem of the media, which was the demise of the Fairness Doctrine during the Reagan administration. The Fairness Doctrine required radio stations and TV stations that were offering one opinion to offer an alternative and competing opinion. That was out the window, courtesy of Ronald Reagan. And then that brought to power, media power anyway, the folks like Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity, and also the two competing camps that we have in this country right now of, right-wing propaganda and, if you want to call it, liberal propaganda. People are living in two universes now, not healthy. In Madison, if you're a liberal and you live on the isthmus like I did for 25 years, you can wake up and watch Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! You can talk to your neighbors as they're taking their kids to the bus stop, and you are, and then you can read The Nation at lunchtime, go home and watch MSNBC at night, and wake up the next day and do it all over again. You can go a week without bumping into somebody who disagrees with you. And on the right, there are a lot of right-wingers who are hooked up to an IV drip at Fox News 24 hours a day. Or they're listening to Sean Hannity on the radio when they're driving around, or Rush Limbaugh. And so people are living in different universes with different sets of facts, alternative facts. And there's not a lot of dialogue between. And in fact, I'm upset that there's fewer and fewer places right here in Wisconsin where we can have debates. That show I used to be on with Joey Cardine, who's retired now on Wisconsin Public Radio, that's gone now. They don't do those debates on Friday mornings anymore. Every Friday morning at 8 o'clock, there was a liberal and a conservative who would debate in a civil manner. And, they pulled the plug on that. The Journal Sentinel no longer has an op-ed page. There are no competing views in the Journal Sentinel. And that is a huge problem, I think, for democratic dialogue, small d, right here in Wisconsin. And the problem of just talking to ourselves in our own camps there's several problems with it. One, it makes you intellectually lazy, or can make you intellectually lazy. You don't bump into other people who disagree with you, so you just kind of get complacent in your own thinking, and you don't have to exercise your intellectual muscles to figure out an adequate or rational answer to the competing argument that you just ran into. It doesn't build sympathy, number two, or empathy for people who view the world a little bit differently than you do. And third, it's just bad politics. I mean, the essence of politics is to get your people out to vote and then to convince a fraction of the people who don't already agree with you that, your view of what is right and just and beautiful is the right way to go. And if you're not talking to people who don't agree with you already, you're not going to get that job done. And it's really important, I think, for us to talk to people who don't agree with us. And I'm not talking about the people in Oshkosh who were flying the Nazi flag last winter, if you saw that on Facebook, as I did. Or people who fly the Confederate flag, and I saw someone fly a Confederate flag with an American flag on his pickup truck 10 miles south of where I live in the town of Dunn. I wouldn't go knocking on their doors. It might be dangerous for one, you're not going to get very far for two. But there are a lot of people, and we must acknowledge it, a lot of people who voted for Trump who are not out-and-out racists, out-and-out white supremacists, who voted for Trump maybe because they didn't like Hillary Clinton, or maybe because their economic situation wasn't very good, maybe they felt resentful that they weren't getting what they thought they deserved from Democrats when Democrats were in power, whatever the reason is. You know them, I know them. A lot of these folks are decent people. And they just, they vote differently than we do. They have attitudes or views that, don't comport with ours, but they are not awful human beings. And we need to talk to people who don't agree with us already and try to convince them that there is a better way for this country, a more democratic way, a fairer way, a juster way, a more environmentally sensitive way to approach the problems that we have in this country. Otherwise, we're just giving up, and we can't do that. We just can't do that. So the third underlying problem I want to talk about is our grossly unequal economy. Our economy that has rewarded the top 1%, especially the top 0.1%, with mounds and mounds of the profits that have been generated in this richest country in the world over the last 20, 25 years. I used to think that it was all right for the rich to get basically as much as they want, so long as there's a floor of decency for everybody else. We don't have a floor of decency for everybody else. That's one of the problems with that. There are people who are hungry in this country. There are people who don't have adequate shelter in this country. There are people who are very poor in this country. So the idea that the safety net is keeping people safe is a misnomer. But the other problem with the idea that let the rich make as much as they want so long as everybody is at least not falling through the cracks is that if the rich get everything they want, they're going to buy the system even more than they bought it already. They're going to use their money to further corrupt the political system. And that's what they're doing. We've become more and more of the oligarchy that Jimmy Carter talked about, or a plutocracy, a government by the rich. Ultimately and fundamentally, capitalism is devouring our democracy. And it's going to devour the whole thing like a snake. And it's munching away at it right now. And we're seeing some of the problems of that. People have worked hard all their lives and they've not gotten anywhere. People in 2008, 11 million people lost their homes. They didn't get made whole. Wall Street got made whole. And so this is a real problem. And so if the economic system isn't working for them and the political system is rigged, they're going to look for alternatives. And if the Democratic Party doesn't offer alternatives, if the progressives don't offer alternatives, they'll look for a snake oil salesman. And they found one. The final underlying problem is racism and the culture of racism in this country. It rips apart the fundamental concept of our democracy, that we're all created equal and that we all have equal rights and that we all should have an equal say. Some of us were lulled into the false notion that having elected a black president, which many of us, including myself, never thought was going to be possible in our lifetimes, that somehow we moved beyond or largely beyond the problem of racism in America. What we have seen in the last 2 or 3 years is racism return with a real vengeance. We have now a brazen white supremacist movement that is out in the streets flying Confederate flags and Nazi flags in America. Unbelievable, but true and scary. Racism was here long before Trump, and we just have not wrestled that problem to the mat. But of course there's Trump too, and I want to get into Trump here and the kind of unique threat that Trump poses, because it's not just that Donald Trump is, Ronald Reagan reincarnated, and some of his domestic policies are like Reagan. I mean, I was in Washington, D.C. working for Ralph Nader right out of college when Reagan came to power. I thought the world was going to end, in weeks, and it didn't, fortunately, but I also saw just the horrible destruction of our environmental policies under Ann Gorsuch and James Watt at Interior, quite similar to what has been going on here with Trump, and deregulation under Reagan. And part of this propagandizing that's happened since the Reagan years and funded by the Koch brothers and other right-wing groups, this ideology, if you boil it down to its simplest terms, that says everything private is good and everything public is bad. That's what we've been sold over and over and over again over the last 30 and 40 years. But Trump is that and a lot more. And let's look at the lot more right now. So I'm going to return to this book, How Democracies Die, because they have some indicators of authoritarian behavior, because that's what we're talking about here. Losing our democracy to authoritarianism, losing our democracy to a form of fascism. And I don't use the F word very often in public. I've refused to use it for about 35 years, but I use it now. These authors list 4 indicators of authoritarian behavior that Trump himself displays. The first is what they call the rejection of or weak commitment to the democratic rules of the game. His bogus claims, for instance, that there were millions of illegal immigrant voters, his assailing of judges, his denunciation of the FBI, his attacks on Mueller. These things are really unprecedented for someone who's in the White House. Number 2 is the denial of the legitimacy of his political opponents. We saw this during all the campaign. I mean, he's just a name caller. He's a playground bully, but he calls people names that he's running against. He did it in the Republican primaries with Jeb Bush, low energy Jeb, and Ted Cruz. I mean, that's absurd. But crooked Hillary, he does it with Elizabeth Warren and Pocahontas. It's disgraceful, but it's become commonplace. So much has become commonplace with Trump that we forget how out of line he is with basic small d democratic norms. The third thing they talk about is Trump's toleration or encouragement of violence, which is part of being an authoritarian. And of course, there was Trump during the campaign when he'd have a heckler and people would take a swing at the heckler, knock the hell out of him, Trump said. I promise you I'll pay your legal bills. Or what he said after Charlottesville, so disgracefully, that there were good people flying those Confederate flags and those Nazi flags. So, toleration or encouragement of violence. The fourth thing is the readiness to curtail civil liberties, including those of the media. And of course, he's talked about fake media ad nauseum. He calls the media the enemy of the people. He talks about tightening up libel laws so the media can't be so critical of the President of the United States. He's threatened to go after Amazon because Jeff Bezos' Washington Post isn't writing favorably of him. Those protesters at the Kavanaugh hearings, he said we shouldn't have to put up with that kind of stuff. He said it's embarrassing for the country to allow protesters. Can you imagine? It's embarrassing for the country to allow protesters. The guy's never read the First Amendment to the Constitution, I swear. He tells the NFL players who are kneeling during the national anthem that they should leave the country. And then his assault on civil liberties wholesale against immigrants is just so outrageous. He talks right now about people being, including the Saudi royal family, being innocent until proven guilty. He does not offer that same coverage to immigrants in this country. He's issued the Muslim ban. Before the Muslim ban, he issued an executive order that said that the Immigration Service, ICE, could deport anybody not only who'd been convicted of a crime, not only anybody who's charged with a crime, but anyone who's chargeable with a crime. Now, this is a legal concept that I'd never heard of, to give law enforcement the ability to deport someone who's chargeable in their minds of a crime. Any ICE agent can deport anyone they find if they can claim that that person is somehow chargeable with a crime. That is not due process in the United States. So those are the indications from these professors. I'm not a professor, I'm undereducated. I just have my undergraduate degree. But that's what they cite. I want to give you some of my own assessments about Trump. Now, he's not an out-and-out fascist. But he is the closest thing we've ever had to a fascist in the Oval Office. I think there's no doubt about that. He's not Adolf Hitler. He hasn't written Mein Kampf. He doesn't have, at least until recently, an ideology that was in any way coherent. He was all over the map. He was a Democrat for a while. He was vaguely liberal for a while on some social issues. But look, he's got many of the inclinations of the fascist, for openers. He loves strong men. Whether it's Putin, whether it's Duterte in the Philippines, whether it's Kim Jong-un in North Korea, or whether it's the Saudi royal family. He fantasizes about being president for life. I don't know if you caught this. When President Xi of China became president for life, Trump said this: "I think it's great. Maybe we'll want to give that a shot someday, right here in the United States." That took my breath away. Other than Trump, as I mentioned, he's a bully. Fascists are bullies. Fascists revel in bullying people. And their supporters who admire them, George Orwell had a name for these supporters, which I just found out or read about over the last 6 months. Orwell had this great phrase. He called them bully worshipers. And we see those bully worshipers at these Trump rallies, you know, standing behind Trump and cheering wildly when he says outrageous things. They are bully worshipers, and there may be millions of bully worshipers in this country. That's very worrisome to me. Trump also echoes the language, the very language of the fascists. During the campaign and afterwards, Trump has been using this expression, America First. And he even used it in his inaugural address, and he's used it since. On the campaign trail, after he used it a couple times, he was notified by the Anti-Defamation League of the United States, this nonprofit group of Jewish Americans that protect our civil liberties if we're Jewish Americans, as I am. They said, look, this has got a bad odor to it, this word, this phrase, America First, because after all, America First was the slogan of the movement in the late 1930s that was actually sympathizing with the Nazis. You can YouTube a video of a Madison Square Garden gathering of neo-Nazis or pro-Nazis in the late 1930s, I think it's 1939, where they're carrying Nazi flags, thousands of people in Madison Square Garden. And this was all under the rubric of America First. So he was told what the historical echoes, ugly historical echoes of America First were, and he has just continued to use it. Then there's fake news. Nazis had a similar expression. They called it, I don't know if people know German here better than I do, probably Lügenpresse, which means lying press in German. In fact, some Trump supporters are actually using the literal German again to talk about the so-called fake news here in the United States. And then there's enemy of the people. Goebbels used enemy of the people, any of the people who refer to Jews. So the language he uses. On top of that, there are a few other things. One is incessant lying. I mean, it's not just that he's just an insufferable liar, but that the lying has, this act of lying constantly has a political effect. And the political effect is just to convince some people that actually his lies are true, and to convince some other people, or to confuse other people so that, you know, he's been lying so luridly and so often that it puts people off balance. And they don't know whether it's true or false anymore. And once he gets away with that, with a sufficient number of people, he can really get away with anything. And according to the Washington Post, as of August 1st, he'd uttered 4,229 lies or misrepresentation. He is going to get into the Guinness Book of World Records that way. But let's focus on the political import of that. Another book I've been reading current book is called The Death of Truth by Michiko Kakutani. Kakutani was the longtime book editor at the New York Times Book Review. This is a slender and very informative book. Here's the first sentence of that book. Two of the most monstrous regimes in human history came to power in the 20th century, and both were predicated upon the violation and the despoiling of truth. And that's what we see when we hear about alternative facts. Or George Orwell, again. Here's a quote. The really frightening thing about totalitarianism is not that it commits atrocities, but that it attacks the concept of objective truth. And of course, Orwell described that in Animal Farm and in 1984 and showed what can happen when the concept of truth itself is so attacked and so despoiled and violated. So that's one of the things I want to bring to your attention about Trump, this lying. The second one is his appeal to racism, his scapegoating. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but look, the fact that Donald Trump is a racist should be incontrovertible right now. It's no longer debatable. I mean, here is a man who, with his father, would not rent their apartments to black people. Here is a guy who went after the Central Park Five, these 5 black young men in New York who were convicted wrongly of rape, and then they were exonerated, and even after they were exonerated, Trump insisted that they were guilty. Again, so much for the presumption of innocence, or even the proof of innocence. He masterminded the birther movement against Barack Obama, which was quite obviously racist in its appeal. And then he launched his campaign with the racist attacks against Mexicans and Muslims. And then he said what he said after Charlottesville. So I just don't think it's even a question now. And we know, for instance, how Hitler used racism and scapegoating. The third thing is ultranationalism, and this doesn't get as much attention as it needs to. Ultranationalism. Nationalism is a very scary little chemical. And Trump cops to being an ultranationalist. I mean, look at his cap, Make America Great Again. What is the expression, Make America Great Again? What does that mean? I mean, in part it's a puerile elbowing of Barack Obama, suggesting that he didn't make America, he ruined America, and I'll make it great. But more than that, it is a fundamental appeal to people's sense of beleaguered and betrayed patriotism. And this appeal to people's sense of betrayed patriotism is the hallmark of the fascists. Mussolini used it, Hitler used it, Pinochet used it, Franco used it. At the University of Wisconsin-Madison, there was a university professor of history there, George Mossey, you may be familiar with, who wrote several books, he and his family fled the Nazis. He wrote several books on fascism and on the Nazis, and he insisted that this ultranationalism was one of the key elements, if not the most important element, of fascism. And we see it with Trump, proudly. Trump is proud of it. And other authors of books on fascism, including Oxford professor Roger Griffin, have talked about ultranationalism as being the essential core of fascism. And combined, if you combine these two things that I've mentioned, the appeal to racism and the appeal to ultranationalism, that combination is really toxic. I like to say that racism and ultranationalism are the sperm and the egg of fascism. And Trump is doing some in vitro fertilization in the Oval Office, and it's not pretty. The last thing I wanted to say, a fact that is distressing, more than distressing, that is reminiscent of fascism, is the fact that Donald Trump has a mass base. Fascism is a mass-based movement. It's not just a couple generals getting together and saying we got to knock off the president and take over ourselves with a couple of our military buddies. That's not fascism. That's a Latin American coup. Fascism is when you have a mass base of support, and Trump has a mass base of support. His popularity, for one thing, rarely drops below 37%. It's much higher than that now, I gather. Beyond that, he's got a massive support at these rallies. And beyond that, he has these white supremacists who love Trump. And they are the brown shirts of Donald Trump's movement. And he can call on them to defend him and to do violence, gang violence, vigilante violence, brown shirt violence. And so to me, that is what is really scary. All these features of the authoritarian or features or echoes of the fascist that we see and hear in Donald Trump. I mean, imagine people marching around in the streets of the United States with Nazi flags and chanting, "Jews won't replace us." And then having the President of the United States say, some of those folks are good people. Look, America is not a fascist state yet. I don't want you to claim that it is or that I said it was. If it was, I'd be arrested or beat up the second I walked out the door, and you might be too. So we're not there yet. I don't want to exaggerate it, because there are people who actually suffered and died in real, full-blown fascism that was much worse than what we're seeing right now. But it could be incipient fascism. And it could get worse in a hurry. That's what's really keeping me up at night. Even, I said at the beginning that fascism can happen imperceptibly. I quoted the authors of How Democracies Die saying it happens in baby steps. They acknowledge that it also can happen, in their words, in one fell swoop. And let me suggest 3 ways that it might happen in one fell swoop, just to keep you up tonight. The first is what's called Norm Ornstein's nightmare scenario. Norm Ornstein is a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative operation, but Norm Ornstein isn't so much a conservative anymore. And his nightmare scenario, which was articulated in the New York Times, is this. Trump fires Mueller, pardons everybody. And I've been saying Trump's going to do this all along. I still think he's going to do it. So Trump does that. There are protests in the street from progressives and defenders of democracy who are outraged by this flagrant violation of our system. And then Trump's zealots and the white supremacists get out there and attack the protesters, and more violence ensues, and Trump declares martial law. So that's a real possibility. Here's the second one, which is also a real possibility, that the authors of How Democracy Die talk about, that Madeleine Albright talks about in her book, which is called Fascism, A Warning. The authors of How Democracy Die say, major security crises, wars, or large-scale terrorist attacks are political game changers, and they represent moments of danger for democracy. Leaders who can do whatever they like can, in such circumstances, can inflict great harm upon our democratic institutions. So the second threat is that if the United States is attacked again by terrorists, with weapons, with biological or chemical weapons, and there's casualties in the United States, it doesn't have to be 3,000, it could be 1/10 of 3,000, that all bets are off for our democracy, that Trump would seize upon that as a way to declare martial law and aggrandize his power. Now you might think that my invocation of the term martial law is hyperbolic, that it's left-wing craziness. It really isn't, because, look, General Tommy Franks, who led the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the ill-fated, ill-designed, ridiculous military escapade of George W. Bush, he said that in print, that if the United States is ever attacked again by terrorists with weapons of mass destruction, we're going to have to suspend the Constitution. Those were his terms, suspend the Constitution. And then there was another high-ranking general, a guy named General Wayne Downing, who is Condoleezza Rice's deputy at the National Security Council, who said in a Washington Post article that if the United States is ever attacked again by terrorists with weapons of mass destruction, we're going to have to declare martial law. These two generals said it. Now, when the generals are talking in public about declaring martial law, you can bet that their subordinates are drawing up plans for martial law, because that's how the military works. When the bosses say, when the generals say at the top of the chain of command that we may have to face this scenario, their subordinates draw up plans for that scenario. It would be irresponsible for them not to. So you can bet that there are plans for imposing martial law in the United States. Okay, if you don't believe me, listen to Ted Koppel. Ted Koppel, you remember Ted Koppel, he ran Nightline on ABC for more than 10 years. He gave a talk in Berkeley in 2004 to the graduating class, and he said this: more than likely, the use of a chemical or biological weapon in a terrorist attack against the U.S. homeland would lead to the imposition of martial law. Those are his direct words. So it's not just me dreaming up these scary possibilities. The generals themselves talk about it. And observant, one of the most observant anchors or reporters of the last 40 years has talked about it. So that's the second scenario, we're attacked. Here's the third scenario that I think is less likely, but not inconceivable considering who Donald Trump is. And that is, the House of Representatives impeaches him, the Senate convicts him of impeachment, and he doesn't leave. This was a worry my parents had about Richard Nixon when he was being impeached, that he would call out the military and have them surround the White House with tanks. You know, I'm reminded of Stalin, who was told by someone that the Pope didn't like his policy of repression of Catholics, and Stalin infamously responded, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" And I want to suggest to you, how many divisions does the House of Representatives have? And how many divisions does the Senate have? And how many divisions does the U.S. Supreme Court have? And so that's a risk. I don't think it's as big as the last other two, as I mentioned, but it's a risk. And if, for any of those three reasons, ugly scenarios I mentioned, Donald Trump declared martial law tomorrow afternoon, you can bet your last dollar that Sean Hannity would be praising him for doing so tomorrow night on Fox News. It can happen here. That is the real crux of the matter. And we can be lulled into complacency, we can normalize the craziness, but we can't forget that fundamental fact that it can happen here, and it's more likely to happen here than it's ever been, at least since the late 1930s. So, why am I not drawing a hot bath and getting out a razor blade? Well, because I've studied fascism. I studied it in college, I studied it when I was at the Progressive, and I studied it when Donald Trump started going down that escalator and announcing his plans. And I've studied it since with my friends in Madison, including Alan Ruff, who's on WRT, a PhD historian, and some other like-minded lefty intellectuals. And what comes from those studies is this, that even when a fascist or a fascist in waiting is in power, that that person cannot go full-blown fascist without the acceptance of civil society. And the good news is that civil society is not accepting Donald Trump. Civil society is not rolling over for Donald Trump. The courts have not rolled over for him. The states haven't rolled over. A lot of states are suing. The media, with the exception of Fox News, has not rolled over for Donald Trump. Quite the contrary. Late night TV isn't rolling over for Donald Trump. And that's a balm to the spirit. Even some Republican intellectuals have not been rolling over for Donald Trump. George Will, David Frum, David Brooks, the woman who writes neocon at the Washington Post, what's her name? Jennifer Rubin. Quite outspoken about the risk posed by Donald Trump. Steve Schmidt, who ran McCain's campaign, has been outspoken. You know, even Morning Joe, not exactly an intellectual heavyweight, has been actually courageous in condemning what he sees. And I welcome all those condemnations from anybody who is raising the alarms, whatever their ulterior motives may be, and that includes Charlie Sykes. He's an opportunist. I don't care if he's an opportunist, as long as he's saying, we got a real serious problem here. Because we need people to wake up to the fact that we got a real serious problem here. But most of all, what gives me hope as far as civil society standing up is that the people are standing up. That the protesters are standing up. And we've seen that since day one, or day two, the day after the inauguration with the great Women's March in Washington with 1 million women. My wife was one of them. I didn't go with her. I was in Madison on State Street with 75,000 other people. We were in a crowd there. We couldn't move. Some of you were there, I imagine. And it was a great time. It was thrilling to be there. And the slogans were great, the chants were great, the costumes were great. The one chant that I heard from some young woman was, we don't want his little hands anywhere near our underpants. And it's that kind of mockery, and Stephen Colbert's kind of mockery, that is very helpful at a time like this. So we had the Women's March. We've had these tremendous rallies for immigrant rights. Here in Wisconsin, Voces de la Frontera doing an amazing job galvanizing support for immigrants. And there were the spontaneous rallies in favor of immigrants when the Muslim ban came down. There were the people, running over to LaGuardia, running over to O'Hare. My daughter was in Brooklyn at the time, and she and some of her friends got in taxis or Ubers and got over to LaGuardia. And so that's been very helpful. There have been other protests in defense of our environment, protests by the scientists, huge protests on every Earth Day. And so it's these kinds of protests that tell us that we still have a democracy that's got a beating heart and a kicking foot. And we need that to keep going. And here in Wisconsin, there's some other hopeful things that I see. First of all, there are tremendous organizations doing great work right now to register people to vote and make sure people have a way of getting to the voting booth. And I'm talking about the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. I'm talking about the ACLU of Wisconsin. I'm talking about Citizen Action. I'm talking about a group called Vote Riders. I'm talking about an umbrella group that I'm on the board of called Wisconsin Voices. They're all doing a lot of tremendous work registering people to vote and getting people out to vote. And how outrageous is it that there are those in our society who tried to prevent people from exercising their most basic democratic rights. We see it in Georgia with a terrible voter ID effort of suspending the registration of more than 50,000 people there just because there's a hyphen missing from one of their names, or they're called Tom on one document and Thomas on another, and there's not an exact match, and so they're thrown off, and 80% of those 50,000 people are people of color. Or look at what happened in Wisconsin with our voter ID. And how outrageous that is. That we had Glenn Grothman bragging that it was going to help Republicans win. That we had Brad Schimmel, the Attorney General of the state, bragging that it helped Republicans win. That the state senators in the antechambers of the state capitol, the second that vote passed, were described as giddy. That it was going to deter minorities and young people from voting. And the person who reported that giddy adjective was the chief of staff to a Republican state senator, Dale Schultz. Giddy. That is outrageous. What's going on in North Dakota right now is outrageous, where they're trying to take the ability of Native Americans to vote away from them on the ridiculous ruse that they don't have a street address. Well, they have PO addresses. They don't have a street address, so they can't vote. It's disgraceful. Absolutely disgraceful. So we have people here in Wisconsin who are fighting that and doing a great job in fighting it. We have in Wisconsin a tremendous effort to get at one of those underlying threats to our democracy that I mentioned at the beginning, which is money in politics. We have this group called Wisconsin United to Amend that has gone all across this state, getting community after community, including Racine, to pass a resolution or pass a referendum to say, we got to overturn the Citizens United decision. We got to say once and for all that corporations aren't persons and money isn't speech. In 132 communities in Wisconsin, we've done that. Wisconsin's second only to Massachusetts in the number of communities that have done that. Amazing work at the grassroots, underreported and undercovered by our media that is so sure-handed right now. There's also this great movement to ban gerrymandering in Wisconsin. Now, it used to be that the idea of that you could get the public aroused on the issue of gerrymandering was impossible. That it's just a wonky issue that only a few, political science freaks and good government people are going to be interested in. That's false. We are tabling at the farmers market in Madison about once a month. I was there last week. You'll be shocked to know, not a passive tabler. So I just stand there and basically yell at people as they're walking by. Sign this petition, ban gerrymandering in Wisconsin. We need fair maps in Wisconsin, and on and on. And we get 200 signatures in 2 hours. And I'm sure a lot of you have done petition signing. It's hard sometimes to get people to sign a petition. 200 signatures in 2 hours is pretty good. But let me give you something other than my own anecdotal evidence, because 41 county boards in Wisconsin, there's 72 counties, 41 county boards have passed resolutions that they want fair maps in Wisconsin. They have sent notices to the legislators that they want the legislators to change our way of doing redistricting, to ban gerrymandering and adopt the Iowa model. We don't have to recreate the wheel. Iowa solved this problem 40 years ago. They don't have the political party in power draw the maps. They have career civil servants draw the maps with specific criteria that ban those career civil servants from drawing maps that's going to help one party or help another. We can do that here. We don't have to wait for the U.S. Supreme Court. And I don't have a ton of hope for the U.S. Supreme Court right now, frankly. We don't have to wait for the U.S. Supreme Court to hear this next incarnation of the Whitford case, which is going to go back, which is going to be heard in Madison at the federal level in April, and then probably be appealed back to the U.S. Supreme Court. We don't have to wait for that. We can elect candidates who pledge to do nonpartisan, independent, fair drawing of the maps by career civil servants every 10 years, rather than whichever party just happens to be in power on those round numbers of 2010 or 2020 or 2030. And remember how rigged the maps were in 2011. How did they rig those maps in 2011? How blatantly and brazenly they rigged them. First of all, drawing the maps is doing the public's business. Did they do the public's business in the public house? In the Capitol? No, they scurried across the street to the Glass Bank on the square there, in the cushy law offices of Michael Best and Friedrich, in a room that became known as the map room, and the map room was locked. It was a locked map room. You weren't invited into the locked map room as the people of Wisconsin. Democrats weren't allowed in, the media wasn't allowed in, even lowly Republican legislators who weren't in leadership weren't allowed into the locked mailroom unless 2 of the young staffers for the speaker who held the key let those legislators in. And once those Republican legislators were allowed into the locked map room, they could only see their own redistricted district, and before they could leave the locked map room, they had to sign an oath of secrecy. That's how the public business was done in 2011. And of course, they hired a fancy scholar and demographer who could rig a map with a computer and draw a line here and draw a line here. You guys know how it happened in Racine and Kenosha, which used to have 2 competitive districts, and now they stuffed all the Democrats into 1 district and made the other district more easily Republican. And so that was pretty blatant. And I think I just think people are sick of every kind of rigging that goes on in our political system. Whether it's the rigging of money in politics, the rigging of funky map drawing, whatever it is, people are just sick and tired of it. That's why you get 41 counties. We don't have 41 blue and progressive counties in the state. Hate to break it to you. A lot of those counties are pretty red. But even in those pretty red counties, people want fair maps. Even in Waukesha, people want, and voted by 69%, that they want to overturn Citizens United. And so there are, these progressive, these pro-democracy reforms are popular really across ideological lines. And the last thing that I want to just say that gives me hope here in Wisconsin, I was at the Progressive for 32 years, and I knew a lot, just kind of remotely, of the other people in the nonprofit progressive sector in Wisconsin. But when I came over to the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, I really got to know these folks. And I got to tell you, there are tremendous people in the progressive nonprofit sector. A lot of them are younger than I am. They got more energy than I am. They're savvier, certainly on social media, than I am. And they give me hope. And also, I'm chair of the board of Wisconsin Voices. We got 55 or 60 groups. It used to be said that, these progressive groups, they're all you know, in their own silos. The environmentalists are here, the labor groups are here, the good government people are here, civil liberties is here, Planned Parenthood's over here, environmentalists there, whatever. It's not true anymore. It's not true that we're in our own silos. It's not true that we are hyper-competitive with each other for scarce resources, though we do scamper around for money. And by the way, we're nonprofit at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, and we will accept donations. But anyway, you know, we pretty much have knocked down the silos. We've shelved our egos, largely male egos, and we're all rowing in the same direction. And we meet, we've been meeting every Friday at 11 o'clock on conference calls for months and months. We go to each other's press conferences. We write op-eds together, we strategize together, we put our heads together when there's bad pieces of legislation as to, you know, who's going to testify, who's going to contact the editorial board writers. This is all of us together. This is the ACLU, this is Common Cause, this is Citizen Action, this is League of Conservation Voters, this is League of Women Voters, this is Planned Parenthood, this is Midwest Environmental Advocates, this is Wisconsin Conservation Group. And so, you know, we're all working together, and that's very exciting to me. This is another thing that flies underneath the radar, but it's an important thing. I think Wisconsin is a model for other states. Wisconsin League of Conservation Voters is the name of that group I was fumbling for. But the nonprofit, the progressive nonprofit sector is very healthy, very vigorous, very dynamic in the state, with a whole generation or two of people behind me that are going to lead the progressive movement in this state, no matter what happens in this election coming up. And so that is very exciting to me. It should be exciting to you. I just want to end by invoking one of my favorite intellectuals of all time, which is Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn, the author of A People's History of the United States, wrote for the Progressive magazine the last 12 years of his life, a monthly or bi-monthly column. And I once asked him to write a column on how he remains hopeful. Why is he hopeful? And he wrote this great thing about, you know, even in bad times, why should you be hopeful in bad times? And he said, we need to remember that throughout history, there have been worse times than what we're in. And people resisted valiantly with great courage against those bad times. And that human history is not just a human history of cruelty, but it's a human history of kindness and compassion and courage. And so he said, even in bad times, we should act as though this is the world that we want to live in, the world that we ourselves will create, the just world. Act in a just and kind and compassionate way. And to do so, even though there are factors beyond our control that are scary. That to act with human kindness and compassion and courage and justice is itself a marvelous victory. That was his expression, a marvelous victory. So I think we should celebrate that marvelous victory that we all can create, no matter what Donald Trump is doing right now, and proceed. And we will, with a little bit of luck, succeed. Thanks very much.
Guerrillero me llaman, oye, justicia reclaman.